Good morning and welcome to our webinar this morning. I'm Rear Admiral Sonny Masso, the Executive Director of the Naval Historical Foundation. Happy New Year and welcome to Second Saturday, which for January 2021 is actually occurring on the third Saturday. And of course, there's a reason for this, as our subject is Operation Desert Storm, the liberation of Kuwait. January 16th in theater and January 17th in CONUS marks the 30th anniversary of the beginning of the air campaign phase of what would eventually become a massive flanking maneuver into southern Iraq to envelop and destroy much of Saddam Hussein's invading army. With this milestone, we thought it most appropriate to choose this Saturday rather than last weekend to present this program. Coming on the heels of the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols legislation that pushed for closer inter-service operability, Operation Desert Storm would test not only new joint doctrine imperatives, but also challenge the American services to fight alongside broad coalition of armed forces from outside and inside the Arab world. Another aspect of the war was it occurred in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the United States had amassed an impressive array of weapon systems designed to battle Soviet forces. In fighting Iraq, we would see how these weapon systems fare in the ultimate test. While much of the anniversary photography you may see this weekend on mainstream media may focus on land and air power, the bottom line is without sea power, Operation Desert Storm does not happen. Pre-positioned cargo ships at Diego Garcia and follow-on maritime reserve ships brought the bulk of the ground power to the region. The Navy provided 6 carrier strike groups, 2 battleship surface action groups in the form of the USS Wisconsin and USS Missouri, anti-air defense with its Aegis cruisers and minesweeping forces, along with medical, logistical, and harbor defense assets. Today, we have 4 veterans of the war to offer perspectives on various aspects of the war. 3 will deliver remarks, while a 4th will participate in the discussion portion of the webinar. Rear Admiral Sam Cox was an intelligence officer with the staff of the United States 7th Fleet. A 1980 graduate of the United States Naval Academy, Rear Admiral Cox finished his career as the Director of Naval Intelligence and is now the Director of Naval History. He will discuss the intelligence picture and offer some assessment of the Navy's thought about this first effort at jointness. Captain Dan Thompson served in Operation Desert Storm as the executive officer of the USS Bunker Hill under the command of future Rear Admiral Tom Marfiak. A 1977 Naval Academy graduate, he had a 27-year career as a surface warfare officer. He commissioned and commanded the Aegis guided missile destroyer USS Ramage, and later served his major command as Commander Destroyer Squadron 2, the Greyhounds, serving as Sea Combat Commander for 2 carrier strike groups. His assignments ashore included 3 joint tours and special assistant to the CNO for Joint Chiefs of Staff matters. Captain Thompson was universally known as one of the Navy's experts in missile defense. He has an MA from the University of Rhode Island in Marine Affairs and a Federal Executive Fellowship at the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University. After naval service, he worked in the aerospace industry and was Vice President of Missile Defense Programs at General Dynamics. To discuss the aviation component and some additional history is Dr. Pete Haynes, a naval historian, maritime strategist, and defense analyst. Having come into the Navy through the NROTC program at Notre Dame, Pete is a retired Navy captain, having served 30 years as a carrier aviator flying the E-2C Hawkeye. During the war, he served with VAW 116. Dr. Haynes joined the Naval History and Heritage Command in 2019, where he is the Deputy Director of the Directors Action Group. He is the author of Toward a New Maritime Strategy, American Naval Thinking in the Post-Cold War Era, which is on the CNO's professional reading list. Following our three presentations, we invite your participation in our Q&A session. Joining our panel of experts for the discussion portion is Vice Admiral Mark, callsign Mert, Fox. Admiral Fox flew Hornets off the USS Saratoga during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He scored the first Navy MiG kill of the war moments prior to delivering his bombs on an airfield in western Iraq on 17 January 1991. He flew 18 combat sorties and led 4 air wing strikes during the conflict. In March 2003, as CAG aboard USS Constellation, he was overall mission commander and strike leader for the opening strike of Operation Iraqi Freedom. He subsequently commanded Strike Group 10 aboard USS Harry S. Truman, the Naval Strike and Air Warfare Center in Fallon, Nevada, and the United States Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. We look forward to audience questions and perspectives from your view during the Gulf War. I'll get to as many questions as you ask. Please drop them in the Q&A section. If you're not a member of our foundation, consider joining. That can be done from this very website. And other than that, gentlemen, over to you, to our audience. Thank you for being here and enjoy.
Hey, well, good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Sam Cox, Rear Admiral retired. At the time of Desert Storm, I was the current intelligence officer for U.S. Naval Forces Central Command, also known as 7th Fleet at the time. And as a result, I was the Iraq analyst, along with my 2 intelligence specialists during the entire course of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Blue Ridge deployed in our flagship, deployed in August of 1990 on 4 days' notice for what became a 284-day deployment. And during that period, I had the opportunity to be in on basically every command decision and briefing, because I was the guy at the front of the room with the map and the stick saying what the threat was. Let me start off with a little bit about the intelligence architecture in Central Command, which had what they called federated intelligence architecture, which we called every man for himself. In every other Navy theater, there was a thing called the Ocean Surveillance Information System, which included OSIS nodes like Rota and Camisea and fleet intelligence centers in Norfolk and Pearl Harbor. And the entire process was designed in order to take high-level intelligence and drive it down to the lowest possible level so it could be useful to operational commanders. Central Command's architecture was essentially the exact opposite, where their Joint Intelligence Center at that time was a glorified briefing shop, and the purpose was to suck in everything from the components so that they could brief the 4-star sync. So basically, we started off with that, handicap. 7th Fleet NAVCENT's intel staff was small. Commander Wayne Paris was the N2, 3 O4s, of which I was one, and 1 Marine captain and 2 cryptologists, and that was it for all the way up until the war. And then we got augmented by 3 more officers. So if you compare that to a current MOC, it's a pretty thin organization. But as we, started off, my assessment was that the major threats were in order were the Mirage F1s with Exocet, closely followed by the mines, and then a pretty robust air defense system. And there were other threats as well, the Silkworm coastal defense missiles, ballistic missiles, terrorists, commandos, a wide variety. The reason I assessed the Mirage F1 as the primary threat was because of what the Iraqis had done during the Iran-Iraq War, where they had sent F1s the entire length of the Gulf at night, multiple buddy tank refuelings using laser-guided bombs and Exocet missiles, and oh, by the way, they hit the Stark by accident. But the mines were a very close second. The only reason I didn't consider them the top threat was because the Iraqis hadn't done much with them during the Iran-Iraq war, but the Iranians had, with essentially the same types of mines, in a number of cases to the embarrassment of the United States. But what we didn't know, and we knew we didn't know, was how many mines the Iraqis had. We knew they were manufacturing their own, which is why we didn't know how many there were. And it turned out there were quite a few. One of the first things that happened during the Desert Shield phase was the General Schwarzkopf, who was a CENTCOM commander, as we were doing the buildup, did not want the war to start prematurely before the Army and the Air Force were ready. And he was worried that the Navy operating in the Northern Arabian Gulf would accidentally, start the war. So he drew a line where the Kuwait-Saudi border is across the Northern Gulf, and he said, Navy, you can't go north of that line. No airplanes, no ships, no nothing. So we conceded a very significant amount of battle space to the Iraqis, where they could do whatever they wanted without us being able to observe. And among the things that they did was to lay, 1,200 mines in that area. It also didn't really work the way Schwarzkopf wanted, because the F-1s knew exactly where that line was. So throughout November and into December, these jets would come screaming out of Iraq, right down the Kuwaiti-Saudi coast, right up to where that line was, where we're all itching trigger fingers to shoot them down, and they would turn away at the last moment. It turned out it was all bluff. I mean, during the war, they only made one attack like that, and it was about as lame as you can get. They had a whole slew of airplanes lined up to shoot down the two F-1s, and they let the Saudis do it for, political considerations. And most of the Iraqi Air Force actually fled to Iran during the war, which is one of the more bizarre things that I've encountered outside the Jonestown massacre. But the mines were essentially our top concern most of the time, precisely because of what we didn't know. We got some early indications that they were doing mine laying. We could get almost no imagery from satellites from working through Central Command, because every bit of imagery was sucked up by looking for Iraqi forces in the desert. There was basically nothing left over to support the Navy, so we had very little imagery of port facilities, no way to have any idea how often Iraqi ships were loading mines or going out to see mines. Got a couple HUMINT reports that suggested they were going out every night to lay mines. And if you did the math from the time we had the first indications until the start of the war, it's like, that's more than 1,000 mines out there, and we have absolutely no clue exactly where they are. And the entire Northern Arabian Gulf is such that they could be anywhere. So there was really no way to narrow down where there were. And, at the time of this, I can't go into the extraordinary efforts we made and other intel organizations in D.C. made to try to identify where those mines might be or where they were, pretty much all of which, came to naught. Other key thing was the Iraqis' air defense network, which was very sophisticated certainly by Arab world standards, better than the Egyptian air defense, which shot down over 100 Israeli jets during the 73 war. And it had been upgraded with a French air defense command and control system called Carry. The good news was that the French were on our side in this, and not being stupid, they shared everything they knew about the Carry system. And we were able to get information from an intelligence organization in Washington, D.C., led by a naval aviator, then Captain Carlos Johnson. That purpose was to take the highest level intelligence and turn it into intel that can be used by, operators. What they were able to determine was that our Soviet integrated air defense low altitude was the wrong way to go. We had weapons that we didn't have in Lebanon, the HARM, high-speed anti-radiation missile, the new EA-6B's capability, jammers and whatnot. And the assessment was that we could defeat their missiles with HARM and jamming, but what we couldn't do anything about was their 5,000 anti-aircraft weapons. So the strategy for Desert Storm was to not go in low, to go in at medium to high altitude above the AAA threat and beat down the SAMs with jamming and electronic warfare. There was a fair amount of skepticism whether that was the right approach, and some of the air wings were a little bit slow to catch on, and most of our losses early in the war were on low altitude strikes. But eventually they did catch on. Another issue that wasn't a Navy threat, but it was the surface-to-surface missiles that they called them Scuds. They're actually Iraqi modifications of North Korean versions of Scud missiles. Al-Hussein, Al-Abbas, but yeah, everyone called them Scud for short. Had the range to reach Israel, Riyadh, Bahrain. One even, got as far as United Arab Emirates. They weren't a threat to ships. If you're a moving ship and you get hit by a ballistic missile, God meant you to die. That's changed now with terminal guidance on ballistic missiles. That's a different story. But back then, they weren't. But the problem was it was a political issue. They were accurate enough that if you aimed it at Riyadh, it would land somewhere in Riyadh, kill civilians. Same thing with the Israelis. One of the key things in the war was to keep the Israelis out by having them sit on the sidelines so that it didn't break up the Syrians and Bahrainis and Qatar and Saudis and everyone else who was, the Arabs who were, quote, on our side. But the result was, huge numbers of Navy aircraft got tasked to chase after these mobile launchers out in the western desert, which was Admiral Arthur, who was the NAVCENT commander during Desert Storm. His quote was that, this Scud hunt is dumber than dirt, which is about right, because when the war was over, we hadn't found or destroyed even one of the mobile launchers. Another significant intelligence issue was the whole idea of conducting an amphibious invasion into Kuwait. I've been told by people who were very close to Colin Powell that this was intended as a deception operation from beginning to end. That was not apparent to us out in the forward area. There were times where we knew for a fact it was a deception operation, and then we were told to plan for a real thing, which was like, are you kidding? We've been telegraphing that we're going to do this, and now we've been told to plan it for real. Turned out, being a deception operation, but even then, as Admiral Arthur said, feint still requires a feint. And if you're gonna be convincing about this, you're gonna have to send the ships up into the North Arabian Gulf to at least pretend that you're gonna do an amphibious operation. And that waters were extremely dangerous, more dangerous than anyone, was willing to accept. But the intelligence that went into trying to plan for this invasion, all the beaches in Kuwait and in Iraq and the Awful, they're all awful. Shallow, long runs. The least worst one was actually in the middle of the Al Amadi refinery, which had 4 super tankers anchored off that the Iraqis intended and did dump massive quantities of oil into the Gulf. But the real thing was there was a liquefied natural gas plant right in the middle of the refinery. And so there was much, wailing and gnashing about, what happens when that thing blows up? And, it's about somewhere between 2 and 6 megaton explosion. So it was like, do we blow it up before we do the invasion rather than have it blow up in the crossfire or the Iraqis blow it on purpose? And our planning group decided we're going to have to blow it up in order to land there. Yeah, that went over like a lead balloon with Admiral Arthur and everyone else. So then the next worst beach was a little bit to the north, which was actually in a heavily urbanized area, heavily defended, but would need basically a blocks and blocks of apartment buildings would need to be leveled by the Missouri and the Wisconsin. No one was thrilled by that idea either. Plus, the amphib guys, expected this to be a pretty bloody operation, and it almost certainly would have been. But it did tie down quite a few Iraqi troops that helped with Schwarzkopf's, Hail Mary Western operation along the backside, western side of Kuwait. But it turned out that the Iraq defenses was so good, the Marines were so good, that when they did launch the ground defensive, they cut right through the Iraqi defenses, and the amphibious landing would have been superfluous had we even gone forward to it. But the amount of intel that went into trying to plan that was immense, and also incredibly, frustrating. The war began with TLAM strikes. The Air Force Joint Force Component Commander had originally not wanted to have the TLAM in the Master Air Attack Plan, and it took a serious food fight to get it in, and we finally did. And then the Air Force got upset because of how much publicity the TLAMs were getting. One, because it was the only weapon system that could go into downtown Baghdad, in daylight, so the press could actually get, pictures of it. And so the Air Force did things like, bomb the TLAM target after the TLAM had hit it before the infantry pass afterwards, so no one could tell whether it was a F-117 bomb or a TLAM that actually destroyed, the target. Tanking was a massive issue during the time. At the start of the war, we had actually had 3 aircraft carriers in the Red Sea. The Air Force would only provide tanking for 2 of them. So one of those carriers steamed around in circle for a couple weeks, not doing anything. The Air Force's targeting strategy was such that they wanted to prove that they could win the war single-handedly with strategic bombing. So the air tasking order, which under the new Joint Force Air Component Commander, the new Goldwater-Nichols, all of that, we were stuck following, was like, if for the strategic phase of the campaign, the Air Force would not hit tactical targets. So missile boats in port, Mirage F-1s sitting on the runway with Exocets uploaded, Silkworm missile batteries that were identified. We had to ask the Air Force to strike those. They didn't, and they sent us to bomb, motor vehicle assembly plants and rocket motor test stands. And so all of these threat systems are surviving for the first week and 2 weeks of the war without being hit. And we're trying to figure out, well, how can we get the vulnerable minesweepers up into the northern Gulf to, one, find the mines and then do something about it without being able to take out the OSAs and the Silkworms and the F-1s. And the only way we're able to do that was to aircraft flying on an ATO target, if they couldn't find it, they were allowed to, like on the way back, if they saw a missile boat sitting in Ashweba or something, they could bomb it. And fortunately, in fact, the biggest anti-ship strike during the war was deliberately planned to be an abort from ATO target. We were given a target that we didn't think, who cares? We loaded anti-ship weapons. They went up. They deliberately said they couldn't find the target. Deliberately, on the way back, bombed Khor Zubair and Qasir. Strike wasn't that successful due to the visibility, but that's essentially what caused the Iraqi Navy to try to do what the Air Force did and try to flee to Iran. And that's when we were able to wipe out most of the missile boats, including almost all the captured. The Iraqis had captured 6 Kuwaiti Exocet missile boats, and that's the way we were able to take out most of those threats. Once Admiral Arthur was convinced that, okay, we finally got most of these things, we brought Roosevelt around into the Gulf, then we brought America into the Gulf. So we had 4 carriers in the Gulf, and we moved them way north, essentially half the distance that any of the Air Force airfields in Saudi Arabia could reach Kuwait. So when the air campaign transitioned to blowing up Republican Guard and regular Iraqi troops in Kuwait, our carriers didn't need the Air Force tanking anymore, so we could carry more bombs, more sorties per carrier per day. In the last week of bombing the Iraqi ground forces, carrier aircraft were dropping as much tonnage of bombs on the Iraqi ground troops as the B-52s were, and way more than the Air Force were because they were flying from longer distances. So the Navy aircraft actually played a significant role in beating down the Iraqi ground threat and basically causing them to not have the will to fight. And it's things that we never really got credit for. So by the time we were done with the war, the Navy was pretty fed up with the whole idea of joint operations because, frankly, there wasn't much joint about it. The JFAC was Air Force, all the way. And they would take the suppression of enemy air defense missions that they tasked us to fly that the F-117s wouldn't fly without. They in their bean counting said those are support sorties in the same category as tankers and cargo aircraft. So there was actually major animosity between the Navy and the Air Force by the time that thing was done. And that led to my cynical view of joint operations, which is, joint operations are about Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines working together over land. But if it's over water, it's like, Navy, son, you're on your own. That's gotten better over the years, but still, show me joint anti-mine warfare and joint ASW, not. So I think I'm probably up against my time limit. So with that, I think I'll shut up and be more than happy to address any questions.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not Kirk Gibson, and it's not the World Series, but I am here as a pinch hitter. Admiral Masso asked me to fill in on short notice to provide some reflections on Operation Desert Storm from a surface warfare perspective. Some background first. How you saw the war, of course, depended upon where you were, and I recognize others will have a different perspective than me. During Shield and Storm, I was the executive officer, or XO, of the Aegis cruiser USS Bunker Hill, Captain Tom Marfiak commanding. We arrived in the Gulf in October of 1990, and for most of the next 4 months served as the Anti-Air Warfare Commander, AAWC, call sign Zulu Whiskey, originally for the USS Midway carrier battle group, but ultimately for the 4-carrier strike force that aggregated in the Gulf. The contributions by our surface Navy was substantial. There are many ways that the Black Sea Navy pitched in, but I'd like to focus today on 4 areas that I think have particular relevance to the kind of future operations where our Navy will again be put to the test, specifically AAW, known in joint parlance as defensive counter-air, anti-surface warfare, surface strike, to include Tomahawk, and last but not least, mine warfare. Short preamble before delving into those 4 mission sets. We should remember that the surface Navy operated in those waters since the Royal Navy pulled out in about 1949. Prior to Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, naval forces were the predominant U.S. military presence in the CENTCOM region. For the 2 years before the carriers showed up in the Gulf, surface combatants saw plenty of action, including combat action. Operations Earnest Will, Nimble Archer, Praying Mantis, and some nifty operations with Joint Special Forces, to name just a few. The point is, when the war toxins began to beat, our ships arrived with veteran officers and crews. Our men had worn combat stripes. They knew the battle space. The iconic images of the USS Stark in May 1987 and Sammy Roberts a few months after that, reverberated every echelon in surface warfare. So our sailors are